Nested loops. In this video, we will learn how to execute loops within a loop. Now, quick review. In the previous lesson, we learned what a for loop looks like. For example, in this program, we know that whatever code is inside this green box, that code will get executed 4 times because 4 is the number that was put inside the range method. So if, for example, we put a print method inside that box, then the print method will get executed 4 times. Turns out, we could also put a for loop inside that box, which in this case, that for loop would get executed 4 times. Now, before we assess what exactly is happening in this program, allow me to introduce a couple vocabulary words. Firstly, this for loop that's inside the green box, we're going to refer to that loop as the inner for loop. And the for loop that's outside of the green box, we're going to refer to that as the outer for loop. That all being said, let's focus our attention on just the inner for loop for a second. Since 3 was the number given to the range method for the inner for loop, the code inside of the inner for loop will get executed 3 times. So in other words, the string hey will get printed 3 times. This process will then repeat 3 more times since the outer for loop was declared to execute 4 times. So we execute the inner for loop once more, we execute it a 3rd time, then we execute it a 4th time. Now suppose I add another print statement to the green box. Now how does this print hi statement differ from the print hey statement, other than the fact that they print different strings? You probably noticed that the print hi statement is only indented 1 level instead of 2. What does that mean? Well, that means the print hi statement does not belong to the inner for loop. It only belongs to the outer for loop. So here's how the Python interpreter will execute it. First, it'll go to line 1 and see that it has encountered a for loop that will iterate 4 times. Then, inside of that for loop will be an inner for loop that will iterate 3 times. So what exactly is the inner for loop executing 3 times? The print hey statement. After that inner for loop completes, then we go to the print hi statement, which will print hi 1 time. Since this entire process is inside the outer for loop, that entire process will then get done a 2nd time, and a 3rd time, and a 4th time, thus completing that program. Now suppose I add another print statement, print hello. How does this statement differ from the other 2 print statements? Well, it differs in that it's not indented at all. That means it doesn't belong to either of the 2 for loops, which means it'll only execute after both of the for loops have finished executing. So when we execute this program, we're first going to see a repeat of the last example, where we started off by printing hey 3 times, followed by hi. Then hey got printed 3 more times again, followed by hi. Then for a 3rd time, hey got printed 3 times, followed by hi. Then for a 4th and final time, hey gets printed 3 times, followed by hi, thus completing both the outer and inner for loops. Now that they're complete, then hello gets printed to the screen. Now consider this program. Once again, we're working with nested loops, but this time we're going to print out the values of the loop variables just so we can analyze their behavior whenever a nested loop operation is taking place. To analyze what's happening here, we're going to get our Python interpreter and we're going to break down this program 1 line at a time. We're also going to get rid of these green box and arrows just so we can practice reading nested loops without the help of those tools. So let's start on line 1. The first line tells us that we're about to enter a for loop that will be executed 3 times. So what's going to get executed 3 times? First, write a print statement which says print the string I in a colon followed by the value of the variable I. Now notice that I use the str method to convert the variable I to a string. Remember, this is necessary. We cannot concatenate integers with a string. To concatenate them, I first have to convert the variable to a string. So when I execute this, what's the initial value of I? Well, the initial value of I will be 0. So I colon 0 gets printed out. Next, we encounter an inner for loop, which will execute 4 times. So what statement will get executed 4 times? We're going to print the string j in a colon followed by the value of the actual variable j. All right, so what's the initial value of j? 0. Then it becomes 1. Then it becomes 2. Then it becomes 3. and then the inner for loop is finished, thus completing the inner for loop. That being said, we're not going to move to the next line yet because the outer for loop is now done. So we return back to the top of the outer for loop. We print the value of I once again. Now I is going to be 1. Now we're back at the inner for loop, and the inner for loop will start over and repeat its process. It'll print J is 0, and J is 1, J is 2, and J is 3. That being said, we've completed 2 iterations of the outer for loop. We still have 1 to go. So back to the top, print the value of I. I is now equal to 2. Then we're back at the inner for loop, where we'll repeat its process for a third and final time. Print J is 0, print J is 1, print J is 2, and print J is 3. We've now completed all 3 iterations of the outer for loop. Thus, we can now go on to the final line, print finish. That all being said, all of the examples we've looked at so far have all involved a for loop being nested within a for loop. However, that's not the only nested loop that we can have. We can also have a while loop within a for loop. In this example, the inner while loop prints out the values 0, 1, and 2 due to the conditions of the while loop. And then that process will get repeated 4 times due to the conditions of the outer for loop. Pause this video and look over the code for a few moments to gain a better understanding of how we obtain this output. Next, we also can have a for loop within a while loop. In this example, the inner for loop will print the values 0, 1, 2, and 3 due to the conditions of the for loop. Then that process will get executed 3 times, a second time, and a third time due to the conditions of the outer while loop. Once again, pause this video and look over the code to gain a better understanding of how this output was obtained. Then, for a final example, we can also have a while loop within a while loop. In this example, the inner while loop will print out the values 0 through 4. Then, due to the condition of the outer while loop, that process will get executed 2 times total, leaving us with this as our final output. Once again, pause the video to look over the code and gain a better understanding of how this output was obtained.